Hello, everybody. My name's Louise. I am the editor for Drone Professional One, which came out at the beginning of this year. It is a book about drone technology and the professional drone industry, and it covers current best thinking, best practice, various case studies from 16 different experts from around the world. Drones are quite sort of in the news at the moment in connection with COVID-19 and helping with public safety. So it's quite an interesting subject at this point in time. But I've got one of those experts with me today. It's James Ellis from, if I get this right, Radboud University. Yep. Great.
Yeah.
James wrote an article on good governance in the book, but we're just going to have a chat kind of over a coffee and just talk about his experience in the industry, about his chapter, and sort of current thoughts on drones today. So how's it, James?
Yeah, it's going well here. These crazy Corona times, but everything considered, things are going well here. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Well, great to have you chatting to us. I'm curious about your background and what sort of attracted you to the drone industry.
Sure. So when I was living in the U.S., which is where I'm from, I got my private pilot's license, and I thought that I would like to go on and do something on the commercial side of things. But as I think is news to nobody, the cost of piloted aircraft, operating a piloted aircraft, is exorbitant. And this was around the time when drones had really hit the scene, and people were starting to find uses for them that were supplanting piloted aircraft, right, or manned aircraft. And so, not really wanting to admit it, but kind of acknowledging the inevitable truth, I realized, okay, maybe drones are, maybe that's the future. Maybe that's the next thing to pay attention to, you know? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool, okay.
And then I guess to explain how I got into it professionally, sure. It's, I was researching for my master's thesis. I was doing a master's in globalization and development. And I grew an interest in how drones specifically were being used in South Africa in the agricultural sector, which is then how we met. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. No, that was interesting. All the questions you were asking about the sort of regulations and the sort of governance part. Yeah. I think we had a very long chat.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we did. Coming from the U.S., and there are jokes among American pilots that the FAA is, I think they say, friends against aviation. So there's this very anti-government, sentiment among American pilots, and I learned that from the ones who taught me. And then from that, I gathered that the FAA must just be this draconian, heavy-handed authority. And then we talked, and lateral to other interviews that I did with people living in South Africa and subject to the South African Civil Aviation Authority, I realized, wow, that's the big thing, So then my research became less about how farmers are using drones and more about what is inhibiting the use of drones, which all signs pointed to socioeconomic indicators, but also governance, right? And in the case like South Africa, it's difficult to fix whatever that may mean, the socioeconomic situation, but governance, one would intuitively think, is, easy to fix. It should be pretty simple to change a regulation if backed by positive exemplars out there in the world. And it seems that's not the case in South Africa.
Yes, she says very markedly yes. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think I think all authorities are having a problem trying to manage this growth, this rapid growth of this industry, and trying to keep airspace safe and to integrate everything. But it does create as many problems as they're trying to solve, I think. And I mean, wherever you go, regulations about drones seem to be the biggest issue that any
Yes.
country's operators will say that it's hindering development and growth and so on and so forth. And it's the number one issue all the time in any country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I was speaking to a specialist, the head of the Drones in Tomorrow's Airspace community in the World Economic Forum about this, who mentioned something very similar. He said that, you know, the countries are still authoring the regulations. It's not like a done process, you know, because the technology is still traveling. Yeah, you could probably find a drone in any country on Earth by this point in time. Yes, but their onset into the commercial scene is still developing, right? So there are countries out there that are making very future defining decisions when it comes to writing the regulations. So I think the message that South Africa tells is very clear and applicable everywhere, right? You can overregulate. I mean, if you want the safest skies, bring down every aircraft, right? Don't allow any movement, any travel of any vehicle whatsoever in your airspace. And yeah, you will probably have zero air accidents. However, two things from that, that South Africa teaches us is that that doesn't necessarily do anything if you want to develop your economy, because drones can be leveraged for such powerful uses in the economic sector. You know, in South Africa's case, there's pestilence, right? So I mean, the citrus industry in South Africa is huge, and you have I forget the name of the moth, but there was that endeavor in South Africa some years ago where drones were found to be useful in spreading a bioengineered moth, right, that would affect the reproductive habits of this invasive moth and help the citrus industry, right? So then you scale that up, and it can have a tremendous effect on agriculture, on mining, construction, so on and so forth. The other thing that South Africa teaches us is that a government is only as capable as its means, right? Because through the course of my research, I found that, yes, the South African government is saying you must go through this intense procedure to become a licensed drone operator. It's great, but the South African government also does not have complete, you know, omnipotent control over its airspace. And in fact, there's a huge black market, so to speak, of people who are just saying, why would I go through all that when I know that if I fly my drone here, you know, to see if my neighbor is overusing water on his land, no one's going to stop me. And in fact, as happened in my research, the government, a separate part of it, is actually going to reward me for doing that. So why would I go through this licensing process, you know? And I think that can be applied to any country on Earth. If a government imposes regulations that outpace its means, then the people are just going to subvert that government, of course, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I mean, for me, look, I try not to be critical too much, but the thing is by all means have rules and regulations, but you've got to police and enforce them. And that's what's not happening. And it's not fair for those that are going through difficult processes or any processes to find that people are going around them to do what they want anyway, and they're getting away with it. And that to me is one of the biggest issues that really needs to be done. How do you manage and monitor this? And that's by all means have the regulations, but you can't just then put them out there, not find a way of making sure that they're happening, you know, that people are doing what they should be doing.
Yeah, but then there's another angle that could be taken, right? Because if there's an inability to police, you know, these regulations, then scale back the regulations to match what you're able to do, and either rely on civil societies to pick up the slack for the rest, or just kind of, I don't want to say let it all kind of go to the wind, but yeah, I think civil societies would be the answer there, right? Because I mean, there are drone associations all over the world, right? And I think that the most dangerous thing that could be done is for them to be seen as pitted against the governments, you know, next to which they exist, right? There's an association in South Africa, I forget the acronym, but it would be a mistake to see that as pitted against the CAA. right? In fact, they can be complementary. And where the CAA is not, where the CAA can prescribe regulations and police them to, you know, a minuscule extent, these drone societies can advise on better regulations that more appropriately match what's actually happening on the ground, take into account the unregulated market, and who knows, maybe become a test bed, you know, that the rest of the world can then look to say, ah, this is what works, you know, because I don't think that the case of the Civil Aviation Authority being overwhelmed is unique to South Africa. I think that everywhere that drones exist, people are using them more than their governments think that they are, right? So good governance doesn't necessarily mean heavy-handed regulation or militant policing of those regulations, but it means cooperative regulation with civil societies, with drone operators, and making knowledged and informed regulatory moves.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we're starting to, what's quite nice is, I mean, we are starting to see systems being developed to help with the monitoring of where these things are. You know, like with civil aviation, having to have these various levels of transponders that are going to tell people where you are, what height you are, all this kind of stuff. That there's, I think it's 20, was it this year? There's, I think civil aviation, most aircraft now have to have this ADS-B transponder. And I know that there's talk about that with drones, and I kind of wish that that sort of thing would speed up, because in some ways it is a digital tool, and in some ways using a digital means to monitor its presence is absolutely critical. And I think they've been doing this with the Lake Victoria Challenge, that they've been developing, you know, like Unifly and Altitude Angels. They've all been getting involved in finding ways of managing the traffic.
Yeah.
And I would really love to see governments actually sort of work with that kind of setup as well, to try and say, okay, well, we acknowledge that this is going beyond our means for traditional aviation. Let's find the digital way of managing this. And, you know, equally, the manufacturers are driving the change as well by, you know, geofencing areas and things like that. But I think, unfortunately, there's still kind of like an analog system and a digital system, and they're just not quite they're just not quite coming together. And it'll be interesting to see how long it takes before there is that kind of marrying up of the acknowledgement of the digital system and using that to the authorities' advantage.
Well, yeah. And you raise a really interesting point there, because, you know, as a corollary to that, governance doesn't just happen in, you know, stuffy offices in the Capitol, right? In this case, in the case of ADS-B, governance happens within the device itself. You know, when I was working at Drone Industry Insights, we were in talks with an academic, I believe it was, a Korean academic who had been working on this. I'm not very familiar with exactly what his technology is, but the basic notion is essentially a see and avoid automation that existed within the drone, right? So it would have this ADS-B in, I guess, receiver that, you know, if it detected an aircraft approaching it at a certain velocity on a certain vector, then it would automate itself out of the way and override any user controls, right? Which, I mean, then you get into these sort of heady conversations that you see also in the automated car industry, right? Of, okay, you know, how do you inscribe governance in that, right? What becomes the priority? Let's say in a cross vector pattern, right? How does the drone discern, okay, which vector should I avoid, you know, for which? You know, or is the see and avoid, does the governance inscribe see and avoid to be the duty of the drone operator or of the manned aircraft, you know? There are some interesting ways it can go, and I think that, yeah, you could say that the obvious answer is see and avoid is on the drone, because it's a lot easier to move a drone out of the way of a 737 than it is to move a 737 out of the way of a drone. But it just, you know, these are the kinds of conversations that are probably happening in Civil Aviation Authority offices, but I fear that they're happening without the council of drone operators and drone manufacturers, you know, who can at least better speak to what these technologies can offer, what capabilities can be stuck inside of a drone, you know, because it might be that we're missing something entirely revolutionary that's just hiding right under our noses. And because we're not incorporating, let's say, the manufacturers, we'll never know, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree entirely. I'm sure in Europe there are the drone councils that are trying to pull everybody in around the table. So the manufacturers, the people that sell them, the people that want to use them, the people that need to control them. And there is trying to be a multi-level, multidisciplinary, what's the word, conversation, you know, discussion point. So I believe that is happening in some places, and I wish it could happen everywhere. But I agree with you that there are so many, this is so different to manned aviation, and there are, in that respect, you need to get everybody involved in this because there are drivers from so many different angles. And I thought what you had to say in your chapter about, well, how does a guy in the rural areas get hold of a drone, all the data, all the value of the drone? Because this kind of governance is preventing that. I mean, sort of maybe cover your sort of subject line again from your chapter.
To bring back up the socioeconomic point that we discussed in passing earlier, South Africa's case, I think any case is kind of affected by its history, right? And so obviously in South Africa, there's an extreme history that drives along ethnic boundaries, right? Such that modern day South Africa sees the agricultural sector as well, it's not even to put it in my own words. I was interviewing a former director of Statistics South Africa who said flat out that, you know what, the commercial farmers in South Africa are all white, and all the other farmers, the poorer and, you know, subsistence farmers, are not white. And that's, you could pretty much draw parallel lines. And as I kind of discovered, I mean, it was an accidental discovery, but I kept reaching out. You know, when I would interview an operator who worked with farmers, I'd ask them, hey, do you have any farmers that you could, you know, send me as informants? And they did, and they happened to all be rich white farmers, right? So there's that history that's always kind of lurking in the background as one thing, right? So then when you put that next to South Africa's relatively heavy-handed governance, that means that to legally operate a drone for commercial purposes, you have to go through this ridiculous $120,000 procedure. Of course, you're basically going to, you know, draw a fence around the only kind of farmers who are going to be able to afford either their own licensure or, you know, the comparatively cheaper in the long run, or cheaper in the short run, hiring of operators, right? So the only farmers that I spoke to, and from them when asking this question, the only farmers in South Africa that are able to afford and use drones for agricultural purposes are generally the white, richer commercial farmers, right? So that's, I suppose, good for affecting the South African export of soybeans and mangoes, great. But what is that doing for the poor subsistence farmer? And who benefits most, right? Because drones are able to provide such intense levels of detail and data when it comes to crops, right? You have several companies in South Africa that are able to overfly, let's say, a citrus field and detect, okay, these trees here are sitting higher than, you know, there's a elevation in this part of the field. So these trees, their water supply is being drained off. So they're short on water. These trees here are being affected by this leafy virus, or so on and so forth. Drones are able to allow farmers to completely maximize their outputs. Now, who needs that more? The commercial farmer with a subsidized agricultural output, and if one year their crops get hit by a drought or a disease, they probably have insurance. Or the subsistence farmer who's literally growing crops to feed his family through, you know, the winter season, or, you know, throughout the whole year. And, you know, the most sales that he's going to do is in the township market, you know, but that's his livelihood. Who needs that extreme access to data more? And unfortunately, due to what I would say is not good governance in South Africa. Those lines that we talked about, as far as socioeconomic access and ethnicity and so on and so forth, are just being drawn deeper because the technology is being corralled among certain groups, and that is not helping the situation, from the development aspect.
Yeah, no, it's a very valid point. I mean, there is I mean, it's the same I was explaining to you before, that it's also affecting the entrepreneurship, the sort of who can actually sort of move ahead. Well, you said it just now, who can actually create the services and provide a way of perhaps even if it was just to provide, like government. If a government department wanted to use drones, they still have to go through a large portion of this licensing process. It is not something that they can just provide. Now, government who has that kind of money to throw around. And I agree with you, it's food security across Africa, across many nations. There is a need for food security, especially as you think in the future. How are we going to carry on feeding ourselves? And the value of drones and the data that they collect, integrated with other data, is massive.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen if there are various different levels of governance that directly or indirectly preclude somebody from being able to use the data or the drone themselves.
Yeah.
So, it's a big issue, I think.
Yeah. And you bring up a really good point as far as food security, because before COVID-19 was a thing, food security was already kind of a stumbling block, right? I mean, in South Africa itself, that, as I understand, it's kind of hit a bit of a plateau. I don't know if I'm misremembering numbers here, but now that we have this virus, and that's just taking chunks out of the labor market, right? Which is where most of the poor population is employed, as far as I understand it. I'm not an expert on these things, but food security at the end of the day is you're right, it's becoming a huge ordeal. And so when you restrict access to, these operation intensifying and economizing technologies such as drones, you are really making it a matter of life and death where it doesn't need to be, So even if that meant something as drastic as a temporary letting up of the regulations, just to give these farmers some window through which they can, maximize their outputs through this insane pandemic, maybe that would be a mark towards recovery of bad governance, I'd say, but there needs to be a long-standing solution.
Yeah, no, yes. I mean, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, you sort of what your thoughts might be on the sort of impact of COVID-19 and possibly future issues, or how drones can either resolve or respond to that, or equally whether or not this may have a negative impact on the drone industry going forward. Curious what you might feel about or think about that.
Yeah, so I did this research as a researcher at Drone Industry Insights in Germany, and I've been discussing with them lately sort of the same matter, and it seems to me that an inevitability is that drones will fill several voids, right? So if we're to take probably the least nice sounding, but probably most realistic outlook for the future, in that our society is probably going to be permanently affected, and these social distancing protocols and kind of the crippled state of our society right now is going to be around for the remainder of the year and possibly into the next years. I think that governments around the world and civil societies, companies, it is going to become suddenly apparent to everybody that drones are just a capability that exists there, not just to take photos of crops or not just to deliver Amazon, orders, but they can really fill in.
Sorry, pizzas. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, but they can really fill in absolutely essential aspects of life, right? So I think that as that happens, as these groups of people are kind of waking up and kind of warming up to the technology, I think that right now is probably a more necessary time than ever when it comes to delivery of professional information, like in Drone Professional 1, like in Precision Agriculture, the previous book that you wrote, and with the market research that Drone Industry Insights does. I think that right now is the time when everybody's going to buy a drone, or you know, people who have drones are going to call themselves experts, you know, and they're going to become armchair analysts, such that social media allows anyone to do, right? Anyone with an opinion can go out there and make themselves sound like a knowledge agent, right? But I think when it comes to legitimate information that we're going to need to restructure our society, and to do so with drones as a potentially life-saving component of that, not even potentially, as a definitely life-saving component of that, we need these knowledge experts to get their word out there, you know, and to advise these processes, you know, because prime ministers, civil engineers, health and safety experts, regulators, they don't really know what they know what drones are. They don't know everything that they can do. We as drone experts don't even know everything that drones can do, right? There's still so much more that can be developed. But it is going to involve good governance and knowledge collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And yeah, because again, like we were saying earlier, off camera, so to speak, you know, this is affecting so many different levels of society, whether it's policing, whether it's medicine, whether it's economics and things like that. And there's going to be a need anyway for multidisciplinary chatting and discussing, and how do we go forward with this? What did we learn? How do we, because everybody's in silos. Mm-hmm. And wanting this for that particular division, or wanting that for that particular thing, and nobody's really yet, I think it's starting, nobody's really trying to come across and say, well, how do we make this balanced approach? And because I mean, the thing that worries me, you know, like there was a report yesterday in Britain that the CIA over there are relaxing the drone regulations so that the police can use the drones to monitor people's social distancing. People have been asking me, can we use drones for monitoring people's temperature? And I kind of think, well, how far is this spying? You know, and you know, and doesn't that increase or exacerbate the discrimination to a certain degree? You know, that kind of, you know, you're starting to pick on people, and how does that have an impact within communities? That what is someone going to do if they do find that your temperature's up? Could be up for a whole manner of reasons, but what will the authorities do with that information that doesn't frighten somebody, or it just solidifies that drones are for spying, which is sad because they're not entirely.
And you could perhaps find a little bit of short-sightedness in that, only because people are walking around with Fitbits that tell the exact same thing: location, temperature, pulse, you know. You know, and you know what, honestly, maybe this is a bit more of an extreme provocative view, but governance can also come in different configurations, right? And we've talked about these associations here and there. I guess a more extreme form of that, but one that indeed you see through different crises, you know, in European civilizations over time, is that, you know, when things get rough, then unions kind of rise, you know, or guilds. Over time. So I guess a more extreme view on these associations would be if an association gained enough power, its social power and credibility, to become kind of a drone operators union of sorts, because then these things could be policed by the experts themselves. It would be a technocratic situation, which could have its own flaws, but I think that what does not help the situation is probably something that we're all culpable for, and that's that you have, like you said, drone operators working in silos. You know, the delivery operators are not talking to the police operators. We're not talking to the agricultural operators. But if you had all the drone operators, let's say in a country, who regularly got together, or they were kind of part of the same sort of guild, and they had their different expertises, but they all kind of followed similar guidelines. That could be legal, that could also be ethical, you know, no matter what the case, we're not going to be used for surveillance purposes, as an example. Then you'd have a lot cleaner of a situation. But yeah, I don't know, that could probably come with its own shortfalls, you know. But it would, I think that that would be the appropriate response in a situation like South Africa, you know. Because then in that way you could probably righteously pit the regulated versus the unregulated operators, you know. But that's probably rambling in a whole different direction.
Well, I mean, there's so many talking points around this, to be honest with you. I mean, it's a really interesting situation. You know, that drones can be used for a positive thing, but there's a danger that it could be perceived as something else or manipulated, and then people don't trust them. And that worries me, because that would be a great shame. Yeah, it's interesting times. If someone wanted to chat to you, you know, after today's conversation and want to get hold of you, how would they do that?
Probably the easiest way would be through LinkedIn, if they just searched James Ellis, so just the letter S and then James Ellis, or I have a website that's the same. It's just sjamesellis.com, and I believe that info is also in my bio, which can be found in Professional Drone 1, available on Amazon.
This by any chance?
that very same book.
Just so happen to have one.
Convenient.
That's cool. I'll definitely add those links as well, because I'll be posting these on LinkedIn, so I'll add that link there. But if I may just say thank you very much, and thanks to thanks to everybody for watching. There'll be some more interviews coming up with some of the other authors as well. Just want to say again that this is available on Amazon in Kindle or paperback format. And I will also be adding those links. But on a serious note though, please keep safe and keep well. And thanks again for watching.